What if the foundation of the most powerful nation on earth was not built on gold, not on steel, and not on oil, but on a tree? What if the very wood beneath the feet of the founding fathers, the ships that carried the first colonists across a merciless Atlantic, and the homes that sheltered the first American winters, all came from a single species of tree so abundant, so magnificent, so perfectly engineered by nature that early settlers called it the tree of God? And what if that tree is now almost entirely gone, wiped from the American landscape in less than a century, and most people alive today have never seen one standing? This is not a story about lumber. This is a story about a civilization that was literally grown from the earth. The American chestnut, Castanea dentata, once covered nearly 200 million acres of eastern North America, stretching from Maine to Mississippi, from the Atlantic coast to the Ohio River Valley. It was not simply a tree. It was an entire ecosystem, an entire economy, an entire way of life. And when it fell, something ancient and irreplaceable fell with it, something that no amount of industrial progress has ever been able to replace. To understand what was lost, we must go back, long before the first European ship broke the horizon of the New World. For the indigenous peoples of eastern North America, the Cherokee, the Iroquois, the Algonquin, and dozens of other nations, the American chestnut was not merely a resource. It was a relative. The Cherokee called it a provider, and that word carried a weight that the English language struggles to translate. In Cherokee cosmology, a provider was not something you owned or harvested at will. It was something that sustained you in an agreement of mutual respect. You took what you needed. You wasted nothing. And in return, the provider continued to give. The chestnuts fell in October, an event so reliable, so vast in its abundance, that entire communities planned their calendars around it. A single mature chestnut tree could produce as much as 6,000 nuts in a single season. The trees grew to heights of 100 feet and widths of 10 feet at the base, giants, ancient and patient, with canopies so wide they could shade half an acre of forest floor. In a good autumn, the ground beneath a chestnut grove was carpeted 3 inches deep in nuts. Deer came, bears came, wild turkeys came, and so did the people, filling baskets that fed families through the long silence of winter. But the story doesn't end there. Because when European settlers arrived and began carving a civilization from the eastern wilderness, they did not destroy the chestnut. They were adopted by it. The early American colonists, English, Scots, Irish, German, arrived with skills but without materials. The forests of Europe had been harvested for centuries, and quality timber was scarce and expensive. What they found in America was almost incomprehensible. A forest that seemed to have no end, filled with a tree that was, by any engineering standard, close to perfect. Chestnut wood was straight-grained and easy to split. It was lighter than oak, but nearly as strong. It was extraordinarily rot-resistant. Fence posts made of chestnut could stand in wet ground for 100 years without rotting. It dried quickly, warped minimally, and held nails cleanly. A farmer with an axe, a wedge, and a mallet could build an entire homestead. Walls, floor beams, roof shingles, fence rails, barn boards, from chestnut alone. And so they did from Virginia to Vermont for 300 years. The tannin extracted from chestnut bark became the foundation of the American leather industry. Before synthetic tanning agents existed, leather, for shoes, saddles, harnesses, belts, book bindings, and military equipment, required tannin. The chestnut provided it in industrial quantities. Tanneries along the Appalachian corridor became economic engines, and the bark of the chestnut tree quite literally put shoes on the feet of a growing nation. The nuts themselves fed not just families, but entire agricultural economies. Chestnut-fattened hogs became a signature product of Appalachian farming. Families would drive their pigs into chestnut groves in October and let the forest do the work. The pigs emerged weeks later, fattened and ready for slaughter, their meat carrying a sweetness that modern pork, raised on corn in concrete lots, has never been able to replicate. This practice was so common, so economically significant, that its disappearance contributed directly to the poverty of Appalachian communities well into the 20th century. Railroad companies consumed chestnut by the millions of board feet, using its rot-resistant timber for the crossties that carried the expanding rail network across the continent. Telegraph and telephone poles, mine shaft supports, barrel staves, furniture, musical instruments, coffins. The American chestnut built the infrastructure of a civilization from the bottom up. And through all of this, the tree kept giving. Because unlike many timber species, the chestnut grew fast. A harvested tree would send up new shoots from its roots within a season, a process called coppicing, and be ready for harvest again within 20 to 30 years. It was, in the most literal sense, a renewable resource that renewed itself on a human timescale. Castanea dentata belongs to the family Fagaceae, the same family as oaks and beeches, and it was in its prime one of the most ecologically dominant trees in the temperate world. It was not the tallest tree in the eastern forest. It was not the oldest, but it was the most generous. What made the American chestnut biologically extraordinary was the combination of its speed and its scale. It was a fast-growing tree, capable of adding several feet of height per year in its youth, that also achieved enormous size and remarkable longevity. A chestnut tree could live for 500 years while continuing to produce massive nut crops year after year. Other mass-producing trees, oaks for instance, have unpredictable boom and bust nut cycles. The chestnut was consistent, reliable, almost mechanical in its annual generosity. Its flowers bloomed in June and July, long after the last frost, a biological strategy that ensured the blossoms were almost never damaged by late cold snaps. The nuts matured inside spiny burrs that protected them from premature harvesting by animals, falling open only when fully ripe. The root system was deep and tenacious, allowing the tree to survive drought, fire, and severe storms that toppled less anchored species. It was, in every biological sense, an organism built for permanence, designed by millions of years of evolution to anchor an ecosystem and anchor it for centuries. The forest floor beneath a chestnut canopy was a world unto itself. The deep leaf litter decomposed slowly, building rich, moisture-retaining soil. The shade was dense enough to suppress competing undergrowth, but dappled enough to allow certain ferns and wildflowers to thrive. Dozens of bird species nested in the high branches. The ivory-billed woodpecker, now extinct, was closely associated with old-growth chestnut forest. The passenger pigeon, once the most numerous bird in North America, numbering in the billions, depended on chestnut mast as a primary food source. When the chestnut fell, the passenger pigeon fell with it. In 1904, a forester at the Bronx Zoo in New York noticed something unusual on a small group of chestnut trees growing on the zoo grounds. The bark was cracked and sunken in places, the edges curling away from the wood in papery strips. The branches above these wounds were dying. By the following spring, the trees were dead. The organism responsible was Cryphonectria parasitica, a fungal pathogen native to Asia, almost certainly introduced to North America on imported Asian chestnut nursery stock. Asian chestnut species had co-evolved with the fungus over thousands of years and had developed a tolerance for it. The American chestnut had never encountered it. It had no defenses. None at all. The blight spread at a rate that should have been impossible. Within a decade, it had moved across Pennsylvania. Within 2 decades, it had reached the southern Appalachians. Within 40 years, by the 1950s, an estimated 3 to 4 billion American chestnut trees were dead. The largest ecological catastrophe caused by an introduced pathogen in recorded human history had unfolded in the span of a single lifetime, and most Americans were too distracted by 2 world wars and a Great Depression to fully register what had been lost. What was forgotten was not just a tree. What was forgotten was a relationship, a 3,000-year conversation between a people and a plant. That industrialization had already begun to erode before the blight delivered its final, silent verdict. The industrial age offered replacements for everything the chestnut had provided. Steel replaced chestnut timber in construction. Synthetic tanning agents replaced chestnut bark in leather production. Corn replaced chestnuts in hog farming. Creosote-soaked pine replaced chestnut in railway ties. The replacements worked. Production continued. The economy grew. And the memory of the chestnut faded with the generation that had known it. This is the quiet mechanism of modern forgetting. It does not happen through violence or decree. It happens through substitution. Each ancient thing replaced by something cheaper, faster, more convenient, until the original is not even missed, because no one alive can remember what it felt like to stand beneath a 100-foot chestnut tree in October, ankle-deep in fallen nuts, with the smell of the turning forest all around you. We did not lose the American chestnut. We replaced it, and we told ourselves that replacement was the same as preservation. Today, a small but determined community of scientists, foresters, and ordinary citizens is attempting to bring the American chestnut back. The American Chestnut Foundation has spent decades developing blight-resistant chestnut trees through a careful program of back-cross breeding, crossing American chestnuts with their blight-resistant Chinese cousins, then breeding the offspring back toward the American genetic profile, generation by generation, until the result is a tree that is 15/16 American in its genetics, but carries the Asian resistance gene. It is slow work, patient work, the kind of work that requires you to think in decades rather than quarters, to measure success not in profit, but in the height of a tree. Some research groups are also exploring genetic engineering approaches, introducing a single resistance gene that neutralizes the blight's primary weapon without altering the tree's fundamental character. Neither approach is guaranteed, but both carry within them something important: the acknowledgement that what was lost had value that no industrial substitute has ever replicated. That the relationship between a people and a place is written not just in history books, but in the very species that share that landscape. That restoration is possible. Not quick, not easy, but possible. You can participate in this work without being a scientist. Organizations working on chestnut restoration accept volunteers for planting events, monitoring programs, and seed collection. To walk into a forest and plant a chestnut seedling is to make a wager on a future you will not live to see fully. It is one of the most ancient human gestures there is. Here is what I want you to consider as we close. Every civilization that has ever risen to greatness has done so on the back of a biological foundation, a plant, a tree, a crop, a forest, that it either understood and respected or consumed and forgot. The ones that forgot did not always collapse immediately. Sometimes they lasted generations, but the forgetting always left a wound. The American chestnut is not just a tree. It is a mirror. It shows us what happens when a civilization grows so confident in its ability to substitute and replace that it stops noticing what it is losing. It shows us the cost of treating the living world as a warehouse rather than a partner. But it also shows us something else. It shows us that the earth is patient, that the roots of the American chestnut are still alive in the soil of Appalachia, still sending up green shoots, still reaching for the light, 3 generations after the blight killed everything above the ground. The tree has not given up. It is waiting. The only question is whether we are ready to remember what we forgot. Before the oil, before the steel, before everything that convinced us we had outgrown our need for the living world, there was a tree, and it was enough.